Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to hear a bit more evidence from Mr. John Lewis, and then we shall move on to another witness later in the morning. So could I ask Mr. Lewis to come back in, please? Good morning, Mr. Lewis.
Good morning.
Right, are you ready to carry on?
I am. Yes, thank you
very much. Yes,
Mr. Chairman, good morning. Good morning, members of the panel. Good morning to you, Mr. Lewis.
Good morning.
Yesterday we were looking at the H&H report for Bellway, the option 3 report. Can we please have that back at NHB 401408? Now, we were on the topic of ACM panels, among other things. And my question is for you to start with this morning. What percentage of the core of an ACM panel had to be mineral for it to be classified as FR?
Our understanding was somewhere around about 70%, 75% mineral to, 20-25%.
Where did you get that understanding from?
It came from a number of sources. It came initially, I believe, from Dr. Lane when we met with her based on what Arab were doing in the Middle East and learning from the situation that had occurred there. It came also from Dr. Janet Morell in discussions from Exover as well, and we were informed that you needed around that percentage for an ACM material to be able to perform, quotes anywhere near adequately.
Right. Were you aware at the time in the industry that manufacturers were claiming that the product was FR when it had a mineral content of less than 70 to 75%?
No, the manufacturers didn't tend to publish that data, not that we had any access to. So I wasn't able to really verify what mineral cores were in the various products.
So how could you tell when presented with a mineral cored ACM panel, an FR panel, for which FR was claimed by a manufacturer, what percentage of mineral content was contained in the core?
It wasn't possible to determine the mineral content. All we could do was to look at the EN 13501 Part 1 combustibility classification criteria, and from those to dig down into the various figure and total heat release rates that were allowable within the parameters of Class A, B, mainly we looked within the Class B. Right,
but that wouldn't tell you precisely what the mineral content was.
No.
It would just tell you how it performed. And you would have then to guess, wouldn't you, that it had the requisite mineral content?
It did, but we looked at, there were successful 8414 tests using Class B materials, notably the Korea test. We used that as an example. We looked at the 13501 classifications for Korea. We compared that to things like alcoholic FR to see whether the alcoholic FR had a higher or a worse combustibility within the Class B if it had higher figures than the Korea on which the test had been done.
But the Korea, as I understand it, was not an ACM panel, was it?
No, it wasn't, but it was a Class B panel which had to fall within the figures that were allocated for a Class B material.
Yes, but that's comparing Korea with an alcoholic FR was comparing apples and pears, wasn't it?
No, not totally. No, they were, Class B materials. Our comparisons were not just alone onto the Korea. We also had the evidence from the failed TRESPA test. And other things, we looked at all of these. We had NFPA 285 test data for a Class B TRESPA as well. Not directly comparable, but there was figures and information in there that we felt, you could use to some extent and go with.
Well, I mean, as a fact, can you confirm this? Korea was a polyester resin concrete panel, yes?
Yes.
Yeah. And Trespa was a high-pressure laminate, yes?
Yes.
Yeah. Not ACM in either case?
No, they were not
No.
direct comparisons, no. But, you know, as I said yesterday, the way that fire engineers were putting this back to us was very much along the lines of how quickly the external panel opens up and allows the flame into the cavity to attack the insulation. And then alongside that is then, you know, obviously the external panel will burn to some extent, and how quickly and, you know, what rate you could expect that external panel to burn. And the comparisons were, you know, very much on what these materials would do when impinged on by flames.
Now, let's go back to the report, please, at page 16. We looked at this yesterday, paragraph 4.3.1 and 4.3.2, and indeed 4.3.3. We looked at that together yesterday. I'm not going to reread it to you, but it's right, I think, that the Raynaud bond here was being applied to the blockwork wall, yes?
Yes.
Yeah. And at 4.3.2 it says the blockwork and supporting system is non-combustible, so would play no direct role in the propagation of fire. I think you agreed with that statement yesterday, didn't you?
Yes.
Yes. Now, what was the basis on which that statement could be made?
Blockwork holds a classification without further test. You know, concrete is classified as A1. The supporting system was aluminium, again, classified without further test as A1.
Right. But if you were going to use this to extrapolate to a different system, you would have to take into account, would you not, the geometry differences, the thermal properties differences, and the differences in the location and type of cavity barrier?
You would certainly look at the cavity barrier positions, yes.
Yes.
The other aspects, I wouldn't have thought were really going to make a lot of difference.
Well, they might, mightn't they? You can't say whether they would or they wouldn't without knowing what the differences in geometry were and what the difference in the thermal properties of the component parts were. It would all depend.
No, blockwork would not lead, in my view, to, you know, it wouldn't really make the fire worse, you know, for want of better terms. And likewise, the aluminium, you know, you would expect the worst thing would happen with the aluminium is it's likely to melt, and, you know, the panels would then drop off.
Exposing the polyethylene core to direct impingement of flame?
No, the whole panels would just drop off because the whole panel was supported on aluminium. So if the aluminium support melted and failed, then, you know, the panels would drop off the building.
Well, what if the aluminium face fell off or peeled away, delaminated?
Well, our understanding was that wasn't really the failure mechanism. What tended to happen with 100% PE cord ACMs was that the polyethylene core tends to soften and melt away at about 90 degrees, and that's the point at which that, you know, then starts to become involved in the fire. And then, you know, the sequence events from there on is that then leads to further, you know, burning, melting of that type of a system, and that propagates the fire. With the Class B materials, the polythene was used more of a binder, and again, you would get the same sort of thing, that the polythene would be the first thing to melt, which would then, you know, lead to some sort of then, you know, the polythene starting to contribute a little bit to the fire and the failure of the panel in that way. But a very thin sliver of aluminium, like I say, aluminium melts at 600 degrees-ish, and a flame would be higher than this, so that it would not be in place for very long because there was no thermal mass to it.
Well, you've got a very long answer, full of science. What tests is that answer based on that you had seen in 2014, 15 and 16?
All that I'm basing this on is what we saw from the 8414 test, looking at what, you know, was left on the rig after the fires had occurred.
Which 8414 test?
Well, Well, certainly the 8414 test that we'd seen, but no, sorry.
Sorry, let me be clear. Are you referring to an 8414 test using ACM polyethylene core?
There was not an A414 test using a polyethylene core. There was various. There was a fire facades conference in Doha, I believe, in 2014, and as part of that, there were various slides and with a video showing the various ways that the difference between the three types of ACM and the way that they reacted under fire. I was alerted to that, I believe, via Dr. Janet Morell, as some sort of evidence of what happened. We'd also, I believe, the address building in Dubai, there were a lot of images from that, photographs, and you could see from that what tended to have occurred with the with the ACM panels.
Can we then go on, please, to paragraph 4.3.6.2, which you'll find on page 17 of this document. And I'll read you the whole of 4.3.6, which says, the Renabond screen panels consist of an extruded thermoplastic compound core, and it says compound core, which I think in the end turned out to be FR, yes?
It did in this job.
Yes, in this job. That's what
we did.
I'm asking you about.
My first question after getting this panel was to go back and say, can you confirm this is the FR version of a Renabond that you're using? Because we didn't want any confusion with a 100% PE code one.
Right. And it then says, 4.3.6.1, when tested to BSEN 13501, the panels achieved a B classification equivalent to class 0 and shall resist the surface spread of flame in accordance with the guidance of ADB. Do you know where that statement came from?
That, I'm guessing, H&H put in based on diagram 40, which says that a class B can meet or be considered acceptable when the English UK version was class O.
Do you know where they got the statement the panels achieved a B classification from?
I would imagine, and I would have hoped, that they'd gone through to the manufacturer's data sheet at least for that.
The data sheet. And 3.6.2, as this panel is shielded from the insulation belayed by the blockwork walls, it's not considered that this panel will play any significant role in the propagation of fire to the insulation material. Did you see any investigations or any evidence of that in the report?
Well, the build-up on this building was the Renabond was then fixed to a blockwork wall, and the insulation was behind the blockwork. So, taking it the way you would expect, the fire breaking out of a window and then acting back upon the wall above the window, the blockwork was clearly, shielding the insulation material.
The blockwork was shielding the insulation material, but it says the panel is shielded from the insulation by the blockwork walls. So what's being said there? The blockwork creates a barrier, is that right, between the panel and the insulation?
My reading of that is the panel is shielded from the insulation by the blockwork, and the panel will not play any significant role in the propagation of fire to the insulation, meaning that if the panel is burning, the blockwork is going to prevent the heat from that panel burning from meeting onto the insulation.
Do you accept that at no time in this report does the writer deal with either the detailed makeup and combustibility of the Renabond panel, other than asserting that it's Class B?
That is correct, yes. The only information that was offered in the report was it was Class B.
Doesn't deal with the fact that this panel, let it be assumed an FR Renabond 55 panel, is inherently different to terracotta and cementitious particle board. Doesn't deal with that, does it?
No, it doesn't.
And doesn't...
Well, actually, I can't, without seeing the report again as to see what technical basis reports they were referring to, it's difficult for me to actually answer that.
I thought I'd shown you that there were 4. We looked at that yesterday. We can go back again if you like.
Not from my point of view. I mean, I remember,
Yes.
this was
Yes.
typical, was that they would choose those 4 reports because they were the only 4 reports.
Yes, and there's now an analysis here about how the ACM Rayner Bond panel would differ in fire performance to terracotta or cementitious particle board if exposed to an 8414 test.
Well, without reading the report again, but yes, I'll take that as read.
Can I ask you a general question? I'd like you to look, please, at BR135 itself, the 2013 edition, at BRE 405555. We looked at this yesterday in a different context, Mr. Lewis, but let's go back to it. There's page 1, written by Sarah Colwell and Tony Baker of the BRE. Can we go to Appendix A, please, page 28? And you can see on page 28, in the middle of your screen on the left-hand side, there are 3 bullet points, and underneath the 3 bullet points it says this: the classification applies only to the system as tested and detailed in the classification report. The classification report can only cover the details of the system as tested. It cannot state what is not covered. When specifying or checking a system, it's important to check that the classification documents cover the end-use application. Now, can we also look, please, at page 32, which is in Appendix B, covering the BS8414 Part 2 test. And this time you see exactly the same text on the right-hand side of the screen, again underneath the 3 bullet points. I won't read it out to you again, it's the same. Yes?
Yes.
Were you aware of those paragraphs in those annexes of BR135?
Yes, I was.
Were you always aware of them, at least from the date of the publication of this edition?
Yes, I, about this point, read BR135, a number of times.
Could you explain how option 3 was consistent with those 2 paragraphs?
Because the option 3 came about, as we've referred to, via the Appendix A of ADB, which stated that the method that should be carried out in undertaking extended application of fire tests, and the route to how that should be done. So that was the route by which we were relying upon the people writing these reports to have done that job properly.
Did anybody at the time put Appendix A and the reference to test data side by side with these 2 paragraphs and ask how they could be consistent? Did anybody do that?
No, we relied upon the people providing us with these reports. That was part of their role, their job, and that they should be doing that. And if they couldn't, comply with these criteria, these paragraphs, then really they shouldn't have been providing us with a report.
Mr. Lewis, that may be my fault for the way I put the question. Before NHBC decided to adopt your suggestion of having option 3 in the first place, did anybody sit down, put Appendix A with the reference to the word test data next to these paragraphs in BR135 and ask how they could be consistent if you were going to proceed with option 3?
We didn't, no.
No. Do you accept, looking at it, that in fact these paragraphs are completely inconsistent with the existence of an option 3?
Well, it's difficult to answer because the option 3 route, was all contained in the PFPF guide, which I'm not an expert in the PFPF guide, but I would imagine has similar wording to these paragraphs, and it's to how far you can extrapolate from one tested system to another.
Well, the answer here is that you can't. Is there anything in the FPF guide that you can recall that...
I'm not an expert in the PFPF guide because writing of these reports to that level of detail was not what we did. We were not there for that purpose. Our role as a building control body was to receive those reports and consider whether that was reasonable, sufficient evidence for us to be able to say, yes, it looks like the building regs have been met.
No. With great respect, Mr. Lewis, that wasn't your role as a building control body. You had, as a building control body, put out option 3. You'd published it as a further alternative route to compliance with ADB. And my question is, before you did that, did you consider how option 3, which you were offering to your building control officers, was consistent in any way with these 2 paragraphs?
I'd have to take a slight issue with you suggesting that we wrote another route to compliance. The option 3, as we've said several times, is purely based upon Appendix A of Approved Document B, which did allow extended application from fire tests.
Without taking account of these paragraphs?
Sorry?
Without taking account of these paragraphs?
It was a route within ADB that led to extended applications, yes.
Well, Mr. Lewis, I wonder if I can help a little bit. I think the point that Mr. Millett is asking you to consider is this, that the whole concept of an extended application, whether under Appendix A or from any other source, is inherently inconsistent with the notion that data derived from an BS 8414 test is relevant only to the system that was the subject of the test, so that the whole concept of extended application doesn't work in this particular context. That's the point that I think you're being asked to consider.
If that is the question, then, well, yes, I have to say yes. That is probably the case. But the likening this to the way things were done in the construction industry and still are done, the suggestion that that you would remove a lightweight panel and replace it with brickwork would very much lead to people considering that was probably going to perform in a better way, and that process would have been carried out and was carried out on numerous occasions. So if that was being implemented rigidly as per what you're saying here, then nothing would have been allowed to be built, because there were only 4 tests, and that would have been all that the construction industry could build on high-rise buildings.
Well, the answer might have been that the construction industry would have to use non-combustible or materials of limited combustibility, not materials which did not qualify on that basis.
I guess that is correct, yes.
All right, thank you.
Could I, another point that I meant to mention initially, that you asked me in the first day as to whether we understood that the Appendix A was suitable for application to external facade systems. In 2018, the MHCLG commissioned the writing of BS 9414, which was specifically a test, a standard specifically for the purpose of extending, test data from cladding systems.
Well, I'm not going to ask you about that. That's post-fire and a response to it. So I don't think it's helpful for us to explore that with you. Can I then ask you about the 2016 guidance note, please, which we find at NHB 6065. Now, there it is. I'm going to assume that you're familiar with this document, Mr. Lewis. Would that be right?
Yes.
Yes. Now, am I right in thinking that this document was what was left on the chairs of those attending the Facades to Tall Buildings conference, which took place on the 7th of July 2016? Yes?
Yes, it was.
Who wrote it?
I did.
You did. With input from Steve Evans?
Input from Steve Evans and Diane Marshall yes.
Yes. Now, his evidence to the inquiry was that you did most of what he called the heavy lifting in writing this text. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Now, on the first page, we can see that it discusses the BCA technical guidance note And at the bottom of the second column on the right, you can see it says this under the heading Common Wall and Facade Types Accepted by NHBC. The following common wall and facade constructions are acceptable to NHBC without the need to provide an option 3 assessment, providing that the design specification and installation meets the minimum specifications set in the following appendices. Appendix 1, brickwork facade. Appendix 2, timber panelling. Appendix 3, aluminium composite panel, or panels. Now, can we just go back to your witness statement, please, at page 54, before we come back to this document? And at paragraph 198 at the bottom of the page, I'll just paraphrase the first half of the paragraph. You say there that it was a generally held view that brickwork was a robust and safe external cladding, so it made sense to draft an acceptable brick build-up. And then 5 lines from the bottom of the paragraph, you say this, my view. Can you see it says my view?
Yes, I can see that.
Yeah, my view was that as I was the one reviewing the option 3 assessments and producing guidance, it also made sense to add timber and fire retarding ACM with a core formed from a minimum 70-30% mineral/polyethylene mix as the other materials where I had seen evidence of compliance through those assessments. Now, just to be clear, I think you hadn't, had you, seen clear evidence of compliance through large-scale testing of ACM panels?
No, we had only seen various option 3 reports.
Yes. And that's not evidence of compliance, was it? It's an opinion about compliance.
Well, it is an extended, the option 3s were supposedly, extended application. They should be more than just an opinion. They should be, at the very best, the people doing that report saying, there is enough evidence to support the view that these would pass.
Yes, it's an opinion about the quantity of evidence and what it does, isn't it?
I guess ultimately it is a very expert opinion, yes.
Yeah, but it's opinion nonetheless.
I guess that is ultimately it, yes.
Yes, and did it concern you that this guidance was based on an opinion or range of opinions, even though from experts, but not on actual test data? Did it concern you?
It concerns me now. It didn't particularly... If I say it didn't concern me, that sounds like I was, oblivious. It didn't flag up with me that, it was wide of the mark, no.
Why is that?
Because the option 3 assessments were coming from a number of sources which were quite well respected, namely Exova, and because of that, we were of the view that mixed with other, I would say, seeing the comparisons between how Class B ACMs burn compared to 100% PE core ACMs burn, we were of the opinion that it was all within the bounds of what was acceptable under BR 135, or would be if it was tested.
Can we look at paragraph 201 of your statement on the next page, please, page 55? You say there, in terms of actual relevant test data, the Kingspan, Celotex and Extratherm BS8414 tests were the only sets of data available. The fire engineers were relying on these for the option 3 reports. Whilst I'd seen a number of successful BS8414 tests, I suspected that more had been unsuccessfully carried out and had not been shared with us or any other fire engineer. It's right, I think, and we've covered this already, but just confirm while we're looking at that paragraph that neither Kingspan nor Celotex nor Extratherm had tested with an ACM panel.
Not that we knew at the time.
Not that, indeed. And the same applies to ACM manufacturers. You've not seen any large-scale testing by them of their ACM panels?
Not to 8414, but I do believe some of them may have done NFPA 285 tests.
And none of that raised any alarm bells with you when going about compiling Appendix 3. Is that right?
At the time, no.
So you couldn't be sure that ACM panels, whether tested by a Leucobond or tested by Kingspan, had not actually failed 8414 tests?
At that time, no, we couldn't be sure.
No. Let's look at Appendix 3, please, on page 4. Let's have that up. Here is Appendix 3, aluminium composite panels. Now, in the first paragraph under key issues, you speak of using reliable cavity barriers, and in the second paragraph, you discuss BR135. You see that?
Yes.
And then under that, you say in the first set of bullet points that an appropriate measure to meet BR135 is, and then the first square bullet point says, the use of minimum class B in accordance with BSEN 13501 Part 1, aluminium composite panels which provide a class 0 surface spread of flame. Now that was a change, wasn't it, from BCA Technical Guidance Note 18, which required materials of limited combustibility, so A1 or A2 only, to be used over 18 metres.
Well, option one of option one of the BCA guidance note was based on what was written in ADB.
Indeed, but this is a change from that, isn't it? You're now allowing Class B panels and not only Class A1 or A2 panels.
We were, if it was, used in the combination of the other items listed further down this, and that was all based on the fact that we'd seen that justified numerous, or that type of construction justified numerous times under option 3.
So, just to be clear, is it right that these appropriate measures are to be taken cumulatively?
Yes, because we went on to say this is the type of build-up that you should use. This appendix that we said we would, we weren't accepting this met building regulations. We were simply saying this guidance note, if you follow what is written in there, do that type of a build-up, we would then not seek another option 3 report for that, for that particular wall build-up.
Well, in not accepting another option 3 report, your BCOs would sign it off as compliant.
No, they would not, because the building would still need to be assessed for under regulation B4. Our surveyors were instructed that they could have a see if this was being if something was being put forward on the basis of this guidance note, and at that point, then in conjunction with their manager, they would still look at the building and discuss whether they still considered that would meet regulation B4.
Well, how could the use of a Class B material over 18 metres, without any large-scale testing or desktop assessment, assuming that they were permitted for any particular project build-up, meet the routes to compliance set out in your own BCA technical guidance note, the very one that the NHBC had adopted in 2015 as policy?
All this was simply, revolving around the option 3 route, that we'd seen a number of option 3 reports based on this combination of materials, and we took the view that all we're going to get on every building here on is the same report saying the same thing. It was, as I said yesterday, things were plateauing out at this point, and it was just considered that and it would. Well, no, that was the route. Right.
Steve Evans accepted when he gave evidence, or at least appeared to accept. Some people may submit he didn't. But accepted from the chairman on day 221, page 145 at lines 11 to 18, that this exercise was essentially an inference based on underlying assessments, which are themselves inferences from underlying data. Would you accept that characterisation of the approach being set out in this document?
Yes, I think I probably would, yes.
So you no longer needed all elements in the cladding system, including external facings, to be materials of limited combustibility. You didn't need an 8414 test meeting BR135, and you didn't need a desktop. That's correct, isn't it?
It is, yes.
That was a completely new approach, which I would suggest to you set your technical guidance note 18 at 0.
Well, technical guidance note 18 was a BCA publication. This was intended purely as an internal NHBC thing.
Well, yes, but an internal NHBC thing with quite a lot of influence. 60% of the BCA market, and it was a market.
Yes, but at the time, our clients at the time were very much shifting towards building with non-combustible materials. They weren't risking this anymore and risking hold-ups to their schemes. They were already moving on to, using option 1 and option 2.
So what was the point of this document then?
It was simply that at the time NHBC was realizing that the processes we were going through were very time-consuming. Just all of my time was on them, as well as a lot of Steve's time and as well as a lot of Diane's time. We were realizing that having gone through all this process, the number of buildings that we were rejecting was very, very small, because we were getting the reports which were considered to meet option 3 and were considered from reputable sources. There was the desire to move to a more of a business as usual footing.
This wasn't, was it, a new route to compliance with approved document B? It was essentially an end run around it, wasn't it?
It was kind of a streamlined option 3, I guess is the best way to put it.
Yes, well, it was a streamlined option 3, which meant you didn't have to do any of the things which ADB required or suggested.
Well, option 3, didn't necessarily mean you did have to follow the ADB stuff. You just had to, put together a report which said that the proposed facade system, if tested, would probably meet BR135.
Can we just look briefly at NHB 402792? We saw this yesterday, I think, but this is an email written by Steve Evans to Brian Martin. Where the response comes back in the way you were not satisfied with, and your response, you'll recall, to Steve Evans the question put by Steve Evans to Brian Martin, the question was, should an external panel be a material of limited combustibility? I'm trying to cut through this quickly. That was the question. He gave you an answer that you weren't very satisfied with. Don't the contents of Appendix 3 of this July guidance note run completely contrary to that suggestion, because you're now suggesting that external wall panels should not be materials of limited combustibility, but only Class B?
Yes, they did, but that was intentional. The email to Brian Martin was specifically asking whether paragraph 12.7 applied. The next thing, the next paragraph on says, or a system test to 8414 BR135. And that system test allowed you to use materials which were not limited combustibility. It allows you to use combustible materials, but if as a whole, when tested, achieved BR135, that was considered, another way through, another option. So, no, I'll stop there.
Can we go back to the guidance note, please? NHB 401293, page 4. Now, in two places in this document, on this page, in fact, you refer to a Class 0 surface spread of flame. What do you mean by that?
That whatever panel, on the data sheet would also have a surface spread of flame classification achieving class naught.
Class naught, I think you know, is not a surface spread of flame classification, is it? It's a combination of a surface spread of flame result under Part 7 of BS 476 and a fire propagation test under Part 6. Yes?
Yes.
Did you intend that the use of the expression class naught surface spread of flame meant that the ACM panels only had to pass BS 476 Part 7?
We wanted a panel which had a classification to class naught.
So why use the expression surface spread of flame?
Because that was, well, the Class O really did deal mostly with the surface spread of flame.
Well,
yes, we could have added extra words to say, the other bit as well, but we didn't.
why did you, I'm interested, why did you have to add the word surface spread of flame in two places on this page after the words class naught, given that class naught is not only a surface spread of flame test, but a fire propagation test?
I think at the time, really, because I hadn't looked too closely into the Class 1, Class O, fire tests. Largely, my thinking at the time was Class O was mostly a surface spread of flame.
Why did you think that?
Because my understanding was that it was a spread of flame classification. I hadn't, to be honest, really, for a long time, read into Class 1 fire, and I don't think I'd really... No, I had read the 476 Part 6 and 7 tests, but it wasn't a thing we dealt with day to day. A panel being provided, or anything being provided with Class O, was very common. We never really needed to delve beyond it to check anything out.
Did you write this here, class naught surface spread of flame, and again on the right-hand side in the middle of the column, in the last bullet point there in the first section, class naught surface spread of flame classification, without going back to approved document B and actually looking at seeing what class naught was?
At the time, yes, that is the case.
How come?
Because we weren't seeing, with these panels, we were not seeing, I recall, panels being put to us with worse than a class naught spread of flame, well, a class naught rating. They were not, it wasn't particularly an issue. There was a big issue with the combustibility of the core material, but the class naught, they were all, from what I recall, coming in with a class naught rating.
Can you see how some people reading this might have thought that they only had to pass a BS 476 Part 7 test in order to comply with your guidance?
My understanding was that you had to do 476 Part 6 first before you could then do the 476 Part 7.
Now,
I'm hazy on this, I have to be honest.
Yes, well, that's helpful to know that. And my question is, why were you hazy? Or were you hazy when you drafted it? Sounds as if you were.
Well, yeah, it was the spread of flame. Sorry, the Class O. That was not our issue with these. That was not, striking us as any, as a problem or things that people were trying to get past us with or anything like that.
No, but you're specifying technical ingredients for a technical guidance note as the senior-most, one of two senior-most qualified fire engineers at NHBC. Why didn't you do your homework and get to the bottom of what class naught really was?
I have no answer for that.
Now, looking at the left-hand side, you can see restrictions on use. And it says, the use of polythene or polyethylene mineral cored aluminium composite panels which do not achieve a minimum Class B combustibility classification fall outside the scope of this guidance note. Such products are unsuitable for use in high-rise situations. Now, polythene there is polyethylene, I think, isn't it?
Yes.
Can you just explain the language? Polythene or polythene mineral cord. In both cases, do you mean polyethylene? Is polythene your word for polyethylene?
Well, it's not my word. It is a well-used synonym of polyethylene.
Right.
And the words I used when writing this was to try and keep it in, simple language that the construction industry people were familiar with. And as I said yesterday, polythene, damp-proof membranes were commonly referred to as polythene DPMs. It was
you did.
for that reason. I agree. I mean, obviously, I knew that there was polyethylene, and that was the correct term. But yes, I should have probably used that.
But it wasn't a typo, was it? You intended to write the word polythene.
No, I did.
Yeah.
You go to a supermarket, you come out with a polythene bag. It was.
If you're lucky. Or you pay for it.
Yes, in the old days.
Yes.
But that was the situation. That was the use of the term, yes.
But you see, the problem I'm having is that Mr. Evans told us that it was a typo. And Ms. Marshall seems to think that the typo was one of the reasons why the note, as it came to be, was withdrawn. Was it a typo?
No, it was, me. I used the word intentionally. It was, I agree, not the scientific term.
Were you ever asked by either of those individuals whether this was a typo?
No, and when the guidance note was withdrawn, I wasn't even, party to those discussions at the time.
Now, we've been through the section of your statement, which is paragraph 108 on page 54, where you refer to the mixture or blend of 70-30 mineral polyethylene mix. We looked at that. Do you know, can you point us, where in the guidance does it specify that the ACM panels to which the guidance relates need to have a minimum of 70% mineral core?
It doesn't, and the reason for that was that we didn't believe it was possible or conceivable that a 100% cored ACM panel would achieve anywhere near a Class B rating. And that was why, on the basis of that as our background knowledge, that was, as we saw it, not possible. The need to actually then start to stipulate percentage cores did not feature at the time.
So, are you saying that you put this in because you thought it was unachievable?
I put this in, I referred to the use of Class B because by saying that, I thought that was then clearly going to exclude all the 100% PE cored ACM materials, which, as far as we knew, would achieve nowhere near a Class B. We thought, they're Class E, Class F. We were obviously not wanting to include those. This was, we wanted the fire-resisting mineral PE cored mix materials, and they were the ones that we were basing this guidance note on.
Why not say so?
Because, as I say, we didn't think it was feasible that any ACM, 100% PE cored ACM would get anywhere near a Class B.
But that's what you say in your statement, but why didn't you spell that out in the document?
Because we didn't think it was possible. I mean, when we released this document, there was a presentation at that Facades conference, and in that presentation there were 2 slides where we spelt out that we were not interested in the 100% PE cored ACMs. We were talking about the FR versions with the mineral mixes, and we spelt that out very clearly in the presentation that was surrounding this, but we didn't put it in the guidance note, and
But in fact, you do the opposite, don't you? Because you suggest here, or at least hint, that a Class B pure PE core ACM panel would be acceptable.
No, that was definitely not the intention of my wording.
But you can see how somebody might read it that way, can't you?
The use of polythene cored mineral which do not achieve that fallout. I can see how it's been interpreted not in the way that we wanted it. Certainly not in the way I was writing it.
If you thought that no pure PE cored aluminium panel met Class B, why refer to them at all?
Well, that sentence, saying the use of polythene aluminium panels falls outside the scope of the guidance note, and the use of polythene mineral cord ones which don't achieve Class B fall outside of the guidance note. That was, if I was writing it now, which I would not be writing this now, that would be a clearer way of writing it.
Before you published this note, did you take the time to do a survey at what ACM Class B panels were being specified in the market?
We based it only on the ones that we were generally seeing proposed, based on the option 3 reports and other things. We knew the likes of Alucarbond, Alupanel, those ones. They were the ones that we'd seen and that we based our knowledge upon those data sheets.
Yeah. But given that, as you told us in your statement and in your evidence yesterday, that a 100% polyethylene cord ACM panel would never be accepted by NHBC, what was the purpose of saying the use of polythene or polyethylene ACM? What was the point of referring to them at all?
Because we wanted to get it across that, don't use this guidance note and use it in conjunction with 100% PE cord ACM, because this guidance note would not be applicable to that type of build.
But unless you'd done a proper survey and had really got to the bottom of what was in the market and assured yourself reliably that there were no 100% PE cord ACM panels out there being sold as Class B, this wording would invite the application of those panels and would pass, wouldn't it?
That's all with hindsight.
Well, no, Mr. Lewis. What I'm putting to you is a factual question. That at the time, did you not consider that without doing a full market survey to assure yourself that there was no 100% ACM PE cord panel out there claiming Class B, this was a risky thing to write?
That was the case. We didn't do that level of market research.
Mr. Lewis, I wonder if you can help me with a related point in relation to this document. I wonder if we could scroll up the document a little bit to get the whole of the right-hand column. Thank you very much. It strikes me that there's something rather anomalous about this, because you told us, I think, earlier on that it was your understanding of paragraph 12.7 in ADB that every element of, or every major element of the wall had to be of limited combustibility. In particular, of course, the insulation and, in your view, the rain screen panel. But what we've arrived at through this route is a clear indication that a combination of a combustible insulation and a combustible, because only Class B, rain screen panel is acceptable. So it's completely contradictory to paragraph 12.7. Now, I know we've got there through the so-called extrapolation route, but did that not strike you as a rather anomalous situation?
Not at the time, because we were looking, paragraph 12.7 was not part of the thinking of the process, because we knew that that was never going to be complied with any of these materials. We were looking at the second option of the 8414 tests, then extrapolated via the option 3 route, then extrapolated to what we'd seen in those option 3 reports, for these type of materials, and then that was why this guidance note.
It didn't strike you as somehow odd that you'd got back to a point which was completely contradictory to paragraph 12.7?
It didn't, and it should have done.
Yeah. All right. That's very fair. Thank you very much.
Mr. Lewis, I want to show you a long email chain at NHB 402864, please. And we went through this with Steve Evans in his evidence, so I'm going to take it a little bit more quickly with you, if I may. But this is a long email chain in February 2016, which followed on from a conference, a Siderise conference, which had occurred a little earlier in that year, in January that year. The subject of the email chain is the use of ACM cladding panels on buildings exceeding 18 metres in height. There's a reference at the very top there to a presentation given to the Facades Conference. Just out of interest, were you involved in drafting that presentation?
No, I wasn't. Steve did this.
Now, I'll paraphrase the beginning of the email chain. Nick Jenkins, who you may know from Booth Murray, had written to Sarah Colwell in January after the conference to clarify whether both Diagram 40 and the guidance in 12.6 to 12.9 needed to be satisfied to comply with the building regulations, and asked also if the scope of 12.7 extended to external cladding and whether the word filler was meant to include the core of an ACM panel. So these are pretty key questions. And to cut a longer story short, he got an email back from Steve Evans agreeing that both Diagram 40 and paragraphs 12.6 to 12 and 12.7 needed to be satisfied. Question for you, did you have a discussion with Steve Evans about that at this time?
I recall Steve saying he'd had some contact with Booth Murray, and it would have been around, those issues. Yes, I do recall a conversation, yes.
Right. And did you see these emails?
Well, obviously it was sent to me. So
yes, some of them were higher up in the chain.
Yeah.
Were you consulted on the contents coming back from Brian from Steve Evans to Nick Jenkins or Brian Martin?
Very likely I was, because Steve would want things to be sense checked, for want of a better word, before he sent it out, and just check that we were saying in agreement. So
right.
Very likely, yes.
Now, picking it up at the page 3, please, if I can, there's an email of the 26th of February 2016 from Nick Jenkins to Brian Martin, which you're not copied in on, and he says, "Many thanks for your prompt response. In the light of the fires that have taken hold of a number of buildings clad in ACM panels in recent years, I also think that the core of ACM panels should most definitely be considered as filler. Some ACM cores meet the rules of ADB, however the ones commonly used in the UK at present don't. To the best of my knowledge, there have been no full-scale 8414 tests carried out to date of any wall constructions featuring any type of ACM panel. I'm aware that 2 manufacturers of ACM have plans to have such tests carried out. This, however, unfortunately means that no existing buildings in the UK over 80 metres tall that feature ACM panels currently meet the B4 requirements. There are many such buildings and their numbers are growing. Whilst I appreciate it is for the designer and building control body to consider, if requirement B4 has been met, I do think the current situation is of grave concern. Surely this justifies the requirement for a less ambiguous statement of the rules." And then he asks for a meeting. Now, I think you've told us that at that time there had been, to your knowledge, no full-scale tests with ACM at that time. You were aware, I think, that there were historically buildings over 80 metres that had nonetheless used ACM, yes?
Yes, we were.
Yes. Even though they weren't materials of limited combustibility?
Yes.
Yes. And had not been successfully tested to 8414 and certified to 135, BR 135?
Agreed.
Yes. And as such, there was nothing, in fact, for option 3, an option 3 report to be based on, as I think we've covered, other than a form of extrapolation from one product to another.
Agreed, but Booth Murray were the suppliers and the manufacturers of a lot of these ACM materials as well, so they must have been supplying them knowing that they were being used on such buildings.
Now, do you know how they were being approved by building control?
I think there was a large ignorance in the building control profession about it. Generally the thinking was if it gets Class O, it's all right. That thinking we saw numerous occasions from other building control bodies, LABC. We even saw it from people in the fire engineering group at the London Fire Brigade that took the view that if it's Class O, it must be okay.
Just to be clear, were NHBC at this time, early 2016, approving buildings using ACM PE?
Well, not knowingly, no, I certainly wasn't, no.
Not knowingly. It's right to think, isn't it, that, and correct me if this is wrong, that the NHBC in the past nonetheless had approved buildings with ACM PE?
By virtue of the approved, I have to take as meaning had a final certificate been issued
Indeed.
by the inspector upon completion of the site works. And on that basis, I think it's fair to say that some had, and we knew about that. In terms of whether they had come across, mine or Steve or somebody's desk and said, can we use this product? And one of us had said, yes, it'll be fine. I don't believe that that was the case. And it certainly wasn't the case for me, no.
But you hadn't satisfied yourself that it hadn't happened.
Well, there was no easy way to do that. A lot of the time, as we saw on many schemes, there's a product was specified at the design stage, which was what we looked at, subsequently was changed when the procurement team on site went to buy it. And that was often influenced by the cladding contractors that were saying, can we use this panel? It's cheaper and it's easier to work with. And that was, that happened, I would guess, on certain occasions. Without reference back to the surveying side of NHBC, it would have been left at site inspection, and the site inspectors possibly never noticed or picked up on it.
Now, we can see, as I've shown you, that Nick Jenkins's view was that the situation was of grave concern. Did you agree?
By this point, the use of an ACM 100% peak, yes, would have been a grave concern, yes.
Yes. Did you send a message to the building control officers employed by NHBC BCS to dig out their records, discover so far as they could which buildings they had approved by way of providing a certificate which had got ACM on the exterior, and contact the building owner? Did you do that?
At this point in time, we had done the 2015 review, which would have picked up everything that was in build up to that point. We didn't do a separate review, in February 2016 to repeat what had already been done. That wasn't carried out. But our surveyors, we were saying this clearly. The major projects team was then put together. There was the large buildings was then being dealt with by a much smaller pool of people, and they were all well aware of the risks of PE code ACM.
But you are now well aware of at least the possibility that there was a legacy of NHBC building control officer approved buildings which had ACM PE core on the exterior.
We were aware that there were a number of buildings that had it on, yes.
Yeah, and you didn't do anything to alert the building owners to the dangers?
Well, I mean, I know you don't like me to say that this was not my role, but it wasn't my role. That would have been left to people above me to instruct or to do that. So me personally, no, I did not.
No. But did you advise your seniors that this should be done, given the coalescence of knowledge, as we can see from Nick Jenkins' email early in 2016? Did you say to Steve Evans or Diane Marshall, for example, look, there's a legacy problem out there. There are buildings we've approved which contain PE called ACM, which is dangerous or potentially dangerous. We should tell the building owners. Did you do that?
I didn't spell it out because they were as aware as I was that these buildings were there.
They might say, well, we were reliant on you as the resident fire engineer. What would you say to them?
They were aware that these buildings were there because we'd identified a number of them when we did the 2015 review. We'd highlighted the fact, that we put those as a high risk in the 2015 review. They'd been at we hadn't done the cladding facade conference, but they knew my thoughts on all of this. Steve definitely was well aware of the risks of 100% PE code ACM. It was, by that point, we were banging on about it every time we discussed this with any of our surveying teams. It was not, well, yes, they were well aware.
Let's go up to page 2 of this email string, please, and we can see Brian Martin's response to Nick Jenkins of the 17th of February 2016 at 9:49. And in fact, I think we want the beginning of the foot of page 1, where he starts, thanks Nick. sorry, I'm so sorry, foot of page 2. My fault. Thanks, Nick. I'm not sure the text really is all that ambiguous, given that it must cover all forms of construction. People often argue that it isn't clear when they are trying to justify doing something that's clearly wrong. I'm not entirely sure that even the ACM products that have flame retardant cores would meet the rules of thumb in the AD, so it'll be interesting to see if any of them get through an 8414 test. Page 3, please. But that's just my opinion. We've recently commissioned a survey of Part B users with a view to feeding into the next revision. In the first instance, it might help if you put your views into that, please. And he goes on to refer to an upcoming meeting of the CWCT group. Were you, when you saw this, surprised to see that Brian Martin was sceptical of the combustibility or the reaction to fire properties of even those ACM products with flame retardant cores and their ability to pass an 8414 test?
Yes, that started to unnerve me at that point, because all we had been hearing before that, which admittedly was from the likes of Exova, was that they were fairly confident that a Class B ACM, if tested with K15, would pass an 8414 test. And then to see that Brian was, it made me question, well, why is he saying that? Does he know something we don't? Because all we were getting fed with was, it would probably be okay.
Did it prompt you to go back and re-review those buildings with ACM from the 2015 review?
It didn't, no, because we were still reliant upon, those experts having, standing by their report and saying that they felt that it would pass pass BR135.
Given that Brian Martin has said here that he wasn't sure that even flame retardant ACM panels could, as he puts it, get through an 8414 test, why did you then draft the 2016 guidance note which allowed ACM panels to be used over 18 metres without any large-scale testing or even a specific desktop assessment?
Well, I didn't particularly home in on that part of an email which wasn't even addressed to me at that time. It was some pages down, so it didn't feature in my mind. And as I said, we were placing our reliance upon those that were writing the option 3 report saying that it would be okay.
And then go to the bottom of page 1, please, in this run, and over to the top of page 2. This is Nick Jenkins's response. Hi, Brian. Yes, I think you're probably right. Top of page 2. In that people are claiming ambiguity to suit their needs. You see that, and then you can see the text of the email, and then immediately under that he says, "What I can't get my head around, however, is how buildings that clearly include products that neither meet the rules as set out in ADB2 or have been the subject of a full-scale 8414 test are achieving building regulation, compliance, completion, certification. Is it that A, the certification has been wrongly awarded, thus pointing to a requirement for better informed, educated certifying officers, or B, they've not achieved certification and are thus subject to indemnity policies to cover the risk?" Are you able to answer Nick Jenkins's question?
Well, taking point A, certification wrongly awarded, the way we were, as I say, approving them was based on option 3, which was then in itself based on the extended application rules. That was how we were, so, in our view, it was not a wrongly awarded certification.
I see. Now, going back to your statement, paragraph 211D on page 57, you say this: "The reason for presenting the guidance note at the seminar was to inform NHBC's customers of the current policy. Having carried out the 2015 project review as set out at paragraph 115, we had blocked many builders' customers' projects from being signed off for building control purposes and insisted they obtain more evidence to demonstrate compliance with ADB. As a result of this, there was concern in the industry and we wanted to explain the situation. This conference was intended to draw a line under that process and show what business as usual would be like. This included launching the 2016 guidance note." Now, you refer to a situation What situation? Concern in the industry, and we wanted to explain the situation. What was the situation?
The situation... One second, please. Let me just read it. The situation had been that a developer had put forward a building with a load of details, which had been passed by our surveyors. Then we had gone back and said, we want you to go through your cladding system again and provide extra checks to extra justification for it, and we're not going to sign off any plots until you do that. That was not just ACM, that was everything, including, as I say, brickwork all the way through and all the other types. There had been a huge amount of resistance, kickback, unhappiness with us for doing that. But having, alongside, running along all that side, we believe that the developers were starting to understand why we had put that blocking condition on. And so we felt that, the best thing we can do, all this has been hearsay via, their local surveyor, the best thing to do is let's have a conference and they can all come and hear it directly from us, and we can explain that situation, why that situation had come about, why these developers were having to put up people in hotels because they couldn't move into their flats. It was that, that was the situation.
What was business as usual?
To go back to a system whereby the B4, the B41 aspects would be dealt with by the surveyor for the job, without it needing every job to come across my desk for a second check to, in effect, make sure that the surveyor had done what a building control surveyor should be doing.
So it was a simplification exercise, is this right, to make it easier for the surveyor and, in turn, easier for NHBC's customers? In simple terms.
Easier is not the word I would use. It was, as I say, we were, having gone through all that process, we were not really rejecting any jobs. And we wanted to just move back to, as it should have been prior to this, that a surveyor should be able to have it within their competence to look at a building and decide whether it complied with B4.
It was a complete backflip, wasn't it, from NHBC's policy the previous year, when you asked that the BCA guidance note be followed.
Well, no, the BCA guidance note was still there. The surveyors were informed to make sure that it was followed, apart from the odd, the few ones that would fit under this guidance note. But that still held true. That process of meeting BCA guidance note was still there, and the surveyors were well aware of that. It just removed the secondary check by me, by Steve, by Diane, before a building would be signed off. That was considered, that could now be left with the surveyor to deal with.
Well, forgive me, let's just, in the light of that answer, just go back, please, to the guidance note. We can go back to that, please. NHB 401293, page 4, left-hand column at the foot of the page. We need to scroll to the bottom. Guidance. Where a building has a floor level exceeding 18 metres from outside ground level, a Class B aluminium composite panel finish is specified, and the builder can demonstrate that the following precautions are incorporated into the specification, design and installation of the facade. NHBC will accept the build-up as meeting requirement B41. That's the functional requirement, isn't it? Yes?
Well, it is, yes.
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 So it's a complete backflip from the presence of option 3 at all. Indeed, a complete backflip from the whole of the BCA guidance note. And let me suggest to you why I put that to you, and you can answer. All you need is a building above 18 metres, a Class B aluminium composite panel finish, and the precautions incorporated into the specification. Yes? That's all you need.
Is all you need for what?
Acceptance by the NHBC that the build-up meets the functional requirement of the building regulations.
No, that would not have been the case, because these buildings were still, It wasn't a case of do that and no one else will question anything else. You're straight through on Part B4. That certainly was not the case.
Well, that's what it says, isn't it? It says...
Yes, but it was not what we intended it to say.
So what did you intend it to say?
We intended it to say that we would not, therefore, ask for an Option 3 report, a separate Option 3 report for this build-up. That was what we were trying to get at. And, as I say, this was released. There was a presentation which accompanied it, and all of what I'm saying here was in that presentation.
Yes, I'm not sure you've disagreed with me. You don't need an Option 3 report. In fact, given that Option 3 was an alternative to Option 2 and Option 2 was an alternative to Option 1, it's right, isn't it, that what you were intending, and indeed did get across to your customers through this document, was that provided they'd met the conditions in the first part of that paragraph under guidance, NHBC would accept the build-up as meeting requirement B4 Part 1 and proceed to a certificate and the build-mark warranty.
But there are a number of layers in between those stages.
Yes, now let's just go through them. You need a building over 18 metres, yes? That's easy.
Yes.
Yes. You need a Class B aluminium composite panel finish, if you can find one, yes?
Yes.
Yes. And then the demonstration that the following precautions are incorporated. And then there is a list, can you see?
Yes.
And the list is a list of products and measurements, isn't it?
It is, yes.
Yes, no more than that.
Yes.
Yeah. So long as your 18 metre plus building has got Class B aluminium composite panel finish and these ingredients as specified, NHBC will proceed to issue a certificate of compliance with the building regulations, building regulation functional requirement B4 Part 1.
No, because once the builder had said our cladding system, the builder would have said to the surveyor, we've based our cladding system on what's in there, so we haven't provided an Option 3 report. The surveyor would still look closely at the materials, or we would be expected to look closely at that, verify the materials. When I say that, I mean verify that it wasn't 100% PE code ACM that had been used instead. They were then required to assess the building for B4 and then to run that past their manager. The managers were a much smaller pool of people who were very much, at this point, knowledgeable of our concerns on ACM. And it was then that in compliance, the guidance note that accompanied this to the surveyors said that in conjunction with their manager, then they can make a decision as to whether it meets B41. It was not an automatic, process by any means.
Well, where are all those qualifications set out in this document?
They're not in this document. They are in the accompanying document which went to the surveyors, the email that went to the surveyors, as to how the surveyors needed to treat this document and to deal with it.
Well, you say that they would be expected to look closely at the materials and verify them. Supposing on the 7th of July 2016, which by coincidence happened to be the date on which John Hoban of RBKC signed the Certificate of Practical Completion for Compliance of Grenfell Tower, supposing he had been an NHBC surveyor and supposing this had been an NHBC refurbishment, he would have picked up this guidance, picked up the Renault Bond PE55 BBA certificate, picked up Kingspan's K15 literature, and on the face of this guidance would have been quite entitled to accept the build-up as meeting requirement B4, Part 1. Would he not?
No, he would have, if he had been, as you say, one of our surveyors, he would have then been required to go and speak with his manager as to, do we consider this was okay? I would have expected that the manager would have, knowing our concerns on ACM materials, would have at least said, looking at the extent that it was used, let's just have a quick word with John, because I was in the office at the time regularly, and I was around. And I think, as I said, we found out at that point that the data sheet for Renault Bond from the manufacturer only gave a classification for the FR version, and it did not give a classification for the 100% PE code version. That was only written in a BBA certificate, who had also, noted that the 100% PE code Renault Bond, for some reason, had got a Class B fire test. I hadn't picked up on that because, my first port of call was always to the manufacturer's data sheets, and the manufacturer's data sheets didn't give a classification for a 100% PE code version. That would have set alarm bells ringing for me.
Yeah, but you're a fire engineer. Most of these surveyors aren't.
No, but they knew the risks of ACM. I mean, generally I was finding that even if they weren't sure, just the fact that it was said ACM, I was getting a lot of queries, this is ACM, is it right, is it not? And then you had to explain, well, there are 3 types of ACM, possibly it could be, possibly it's not, find out specifically which one it is. And we would go through that sort of a process. I can't say for certainty, but I would very much have expected that that would have been the process that would have gone on in NHBC.
Mr. Chairman, before the break, and I'm afraid I'm not going to finish before the break, we have one short topic to cover afterwards. Can I just finish off this line?
Yes, of course.
Can I just show you then, please, the witness statement of Stuart Taylor from Wintec, who were specialist facade engineers we looked at during the course of your evidence. And we know you met them in 2013, as we've seen. This is at WIN 702, paragraph 103, foot of page 45. And he says, this in answer to the question from the inquiry, what were your views, or if different, what are your views now on the content of this note? And he says this: I cannot recall when I first saw this document. My views were that I completely disagreed with its contents. The document generally allowed the use of materials which are not classed as limited combustibility, Class A2 in accordance with EN 13501. For example, the guidance in Appendix 3, aluminium composite panels, allows minimum Class B ACM panels, combustible insulation in the SFS zone, minimum Class B cement particle sheathing board, and K15 or Celotex RS5000 or extra firm foam insulation in a drained and ventilated cavity. This guidance in no way resembles the guidance in ADB 2 2007. I regarded the document as being quite irresponsible, and I did not know why such a document had been produced, especially after Wintec had spoken to the NHBC in 2013 about the issues of using combustible materials on buildings with a story equal to or greater than 18 metres. Do you disagree with anything that Mr. Taylor says there?
The only bit I have to not take issue with, but, query, the bit about being quite irresponsible. We were not wanting to be irresponsible. We were, trying to do things in a better way. That implies that we were quite blasé about it. That was certainly not the case. But apart from that, I think what he says is probably true.
Right. Let me suggest to you that his characterisation of this note as completely irresponsible, or quite irresponsible, is correct, and it was a dangerous mistake on the part of the NHBC, designed to go back to business as usual and at the expense of life safety. What do you say to that?
I have to agree. It shouldn't have been written. If it was, no, it shouldn't have been written. We shouldn't have done it. I mean, in all of this, as I say, that we did do a review afterwards as to where this any buildings had relied upon this guidance note, and in that review we found that it had not been used and on any building that we could identify. That is its only saving grace, for want of a better word, from my point of view, is that it never actually got used.
Is that a convenient moment, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, I think it is. Thank you very much. Well, I think it's time we had a break for the morning. Mr. Lewis, we will come back, please, at 11:45. And as before, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence when we're out of the room.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. 11:45, please. Could you ask Mr. Lewis to come back in, please? Right, Mr. Lewis, on we go. Yes, Mr. Millett.
Mr. Chairman, having reviewed my note of my examination of Mr. Lewis, I've come to the conclusion that I have asked him all I need to ask him, subject to any questions coming from other court participants, which we can do in the usual way. So I'm going to ask you to rise for the usual time, let's say 15 minutes, and come back at noon or just after noon.
Yes, right, thank you. Well, Mr. Lewis, just so you understand, when we get to the end of Council's prepared questions, we need to have a short break so that Council just can check, although I think he's done that he hasn't got any more questions, but also to allow other people who are following the proceedings from other places can suggest further questions that we might want to put to you. So we will have that break now. I'm sorry to get you in and out in such rapidity, but we'll have the break now. We'll come back at 12 noon, and then we'll see if there are any more questions we need to ask you. All right? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'd like to go with the usher, please. Thank you. Mr. Millett, I've said 12 o'clock. Of course, if it turns out that more time is required, you can ask the usher to come and let us know.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Would you ask Mr. Lewis to come back in, please? Okay. Right, Mr. Lewis, well, let's see if there are any more questions for you. Yes, Mr.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, just one or two. In the transcript for yesterday, you had said that there were some buildings where there had been other works needed, and you'd never been able to reject a building. And you said the one building where we were adamant was very unsafe, you only had it for warranty, and they just withdrew the warranty and took it with someone else. You recall saying that?
Yes, indeed.
Was that the Apex project?
It was, yes.
Did the Apex project concern a building with 100% PE called ACM?
Yes, it did.
It did. And was that a building where the building control final certificate was provided by the local authority? Ealing, I think, in that case.
It was, yes.
And I think it's right, isn't it? You may recall that the builder had submitted a detailed report from Dr. Connolly.
Yes, indeed.
The eminent Dr. Connolly. And that had said that the cladding was compliant with the building regulations and presented an acceptable risk. Yes? Do you
Indeed,
remember that?
I recall there were at least 2, possibly 3 versions of that report, yes.
Right. But nonetheless, NHBC refused warranty cover.
We did indeed, yes.
And do you know what happened in the end?
As you say, the company, the developer, obviously weighed up their options of either removing the cladding to continue with NHBC cover. They went to another warranty provider who obviously said they were prepared to accept it as it stood, and it was taken on that basis.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Well, Mr. Lewis, I've no further questions for you. It remains only for me to thank you very much for coming to the inquiry and thanking you for your assistance. We're extremely grateful to you. So thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
And it's right that I should thank you as well, Mr. Lewis, on behalf of all 3 members of the panel. You've given evidence for quite a long time. I'm sorry it went on a little longer than you were originally led to believe, but it has been very useful and helpful to hear what you have to tell us. So we are very grateful to you for coming to give your evidence. And now you're finished and you're free to go. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, Mr. Millett, I think you have another witness
Yes.
for us, don't you? But
Yes, we do.
we will need to rise for a few moments before you call that witness so that the usual housekeeping arrangements can be made. So we'll rise and perhaps the usher would come and tell us as soon as you're ready.
Very good, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Willett. Now, if you have another witness for us.
Yes, our final NHBC witness is Miss Diane Marshall. So may I please call Miss Marshall now?
Thank you. Good morning, Miss Marshall. I understand you're going to swear the oath.
I am, yes.
Right, there should be a testament there on the desk. Could you take the testament in your right hand, please, and read the words on the screen?
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Now, please sit down. Make yourself comfortable there.
Thank you.
Yes, when you're ready, Mr. Willett.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr.
you.
Chairman. Ms. Marshall, good morning. Can I start by thanking you very much for coming to the inquiry and assisting us with our investigations? We're extremely grateful to you. If you have any difficulty understanding my questions, I can put the question again or rephrase it as you would like. But please just do say. When answering my questions, please don't nod or shake your head. You have to say yes or no, as the case may be. And it's also important that we don't overspeak and also that you speak clearly so that the transcriber who sits to your right there can get down exactly what it is you're telling us. We'll take scheduled breaks in the usual way in the afternoon and in the morning, but if you need a break at any other time, please let us know. Now, you've provided one witness statement to the inquiry. Can I take you to it, please? It'll appear on your screen, as will all the documents that I'm going to be looking at with you. It's NHB 403434. And the first page bears the date 6th of October 2021. Could you please be shown page 47? You can see a signature there above the date 6th of October 2021. Is that your signature?
It is, yes.
And this is your witness statement?
It is, yes.
And have you read this witness statement recently?
Yes.
And can you confirm for us that the contents are true?
My legal team have sent through a letter with some observations of corrections.
Yes, they have. And subject to those, can you confirm that its contents are true?
Yes.
And subject to those corrections, have you discussed your statement or your evidence with anybody before coming here today?
Only with my legal team.
Yes. Now let's look at those corrections. Can we please first see paragraph 84? That's on page 20, and you can see that that refers to confusion in paragraph 84A. Do you see that?
Yes.
What would you like to tell us about that?
Just that the timeline in relation to the December 13 email, I've got the confusion incorrect, that the confusion at this stage was in relation to Kingspan being certified as a material of limited combustibility, not in relation to the changes to the BBA certificate.
Thank
so
you.
the second part of paragraph A.
Can we look at paragraph 167, please? And there you see what's said there. Would you like to make a correction to that?
Yes, I was copied into that email. It doesn't change the context, but I did see that email as I was copied in.
And then on, please, to paragraph 188. At the foot of page 39 there. Is there a correction you wish to make to that paragraph?
Yes, the second bottom line, NHBC fire engineers were required to carry out a robust process checking of each project submitted. That wasn't the case with the 2016 guidance note.
No, thank you. And paragraph 202, finally. I think there's a typographical error. Would you like us to identify it?
Yes, the final date, the 25th of August, should be 2017, not
Yes.
2018.
Yes, thank you very much. Now, can I start then my substantive questions to you by asking you about your background and your previous employment and your role at the NHBC? Looking at paragraph 9 of your statement, please, if we can go to that. You say there on page 2, under the heading Qualifications, Training and Career, that you, and I'm going to summarise that, you were a trainee building control surveyor from 1983, or in 1983, yes?
Yes.
And then in 1991 you qualified as a building surveyor.
Yes.
And you then obtained a first-class degree in building engineering, yes?
Yes.
Do you know when that was? Or can you remember when that was?
2006, 2007.
And if you look down to paragraph 10, you say that before that, or before working at NHBC, you were a building surveyor. Who did you work for?
I worked for 2 different local authorities prior to joining NHBC.
Which were they?
Bedford Borough Council and North Hertfordshire District Council.
And during your time as a surveyor, did you deal with buildings over 18 metres in your day-to-day work?
I had a limited exposure to buildings of that height due to the geographical nature of the local authorities that I worked in.
Yes. And were you involved at all in providing building control services or final sign-off for residential buildings over 18 metres when at those authorities?
I don't recall, but that doesn't mean that I didn't.
Now you say that you had, and this is paragraph 10, that you'd undertaken regular training on the building regulations during your time as a surveyor. Did any of that training concern fire safety in buildings over 18 metres?
The training would have been in relation to the requirements of Approved Document B in its entirety, and that would have covered the range of buildings of residential, non-residential, and over 18 metres and under 18 metres.
Did you have any training on those matters after you joined NHBC?
I wouldn't say specific training. I would have sat in on training being delivered at team meetings. I wouldn't have necessarily been there to receive formal training, right, as I didn't apply it on a day-to-day basis.
Now, we know you joined NHBC in 2001.
Correct.
So does that tell us that you didn't have any training, or at least any formal training, on the ADB amendments in 2006-7, or the Building Regulations 2010, or the various different industry guidance documents such as the CWCT Technical Note 73 or BCA Guidance Note, Technical Note 18?
Well, as I say, I would have sat through the training material. I would have seen some of the training material because I had a building control training manager that reported to me that developed the training material and would run it past me. So I would be aware of the requirements. I wouldn't be familiar with how they would be applied on a project-by-project basis.
Now, if we look at paragraph 11, just further down page 2, you set out the positions that you have held at NHBC since joining in 2001. It doesn't say what position you held when you joined. What was it?
I joined as a surveying manager.
Surveying manager. And who did you report to at that time?
Neil Cooper.
Did that position deal with residential buildings over 18 metres?
The team that I managed did, yes.
The team that you managed did. So did that mean that you had to become familiar with the rules concerning buildings over 18 metres?
I was familiar with the rules in terms of the high-level training that I would have received with updates to the regulations and obviously reading new approved documents as they were published. I wouldn't be familiar with the day-to-day application of those on a project-specific basis.
Do you remember what types of buildings you did deal with as a building control manager once you became appointed to that position between 2006 and 2007?
That role was the oversight of a number of the area managers. The surveying manager position that I joined in 2001, there were 5 of those across the country, and the building control manager was the manager overseeing that role.
I see. And did that role involve buildings over 18 metres?
The teams dealing with them, yes.
And your oversight of those teams, presumably,
yes,
as well, yes. And can you tell us what sort of percentage would you say of the buildings you worked on by way of your supervisory role were buildings over 18 metres?
Sorry, could you just clarify what you mean by I worked on?
Well, in your role as a building control manager between 2006 and 2007, what sort of percentage, in rough terms, would you say comprise buildings over 18 metres?
That my teams dealt with?
Yeah.
Right. I would say probably less than 50% of our that profile of work. If I can put some context around the percentages, that might help. So NHBC has a warranty market share of around about 75%. That's to the end of 2020, and that's reliant on published government figures in housing returns. The way that we measure our building control market share is a percentage of that warranty. So we report on building control take-up in relation to the warranty product that we offer. So where we report 60 to 70% of building control over the previous 7 years, that would be as a proportion of our warranty market. And then that 60 to 70% is then broken down further to answer your question. It would be less than 50% of the high-rise market that we would provide building control, where we're also providing warranty.
And those that crossed your desk in that time frame, what sort of percentage of high-rise projects, in other words, projects over 18 metres, would that have represented?
They would generally only be referred to me if there was an issue or an escalation or a question in relation to the construction or any element of that project that required management intervention.
You then became acting head of building control in, I think, 2007, yes?
Yes.
And that lasted a year before you became group head of building control in 2008.
Correct.
Again, during that period, what sort of percentage of high-rise projects crossed your desk?
Again, it would be by exception in relation to any major concerns or issues around interpretation.
Now, you were then, I think, as you say, promoted to head of technical services in 2012, yes?
Yes.
And held that position until 2017, as you tell us. Now, to be clear, being acting head of and then group head of building control, before then being made head of technical services, does that mean that you effectively have been in charge of NHBC building control since 2007?
Yes.
Yes. Now, I know the name of the department's changed over a number of years, but I think Steve Evans says in his statement that the technical services department was responsible for, as he puts it, confirming compliance in terms of warranty cover and building control services. That's how he puts it. Would you agree with that characterisation?
Yes.
Yes. And that was essentially your responsibility from 2007, yes?
Yes.
Yes. And remained your responsibility when you became head of technical operations in 2018, yes?
Yes.
Yes. So it was essentially a name change, but the role remained the same, yes?
Yeah, it was merging different departments within the organisation.
And then you, I think, moved to your current position of operations director in 2019. Is that right?
Correct.
Now, in the years up to 2013, is it right that your experience in providing building control expertise or experience for high-rise residential buildings was by way of exception? Would that be a fair way of putting it?
Yes.
And would that also apply to your experience in rain screen cladding and external facades on buildings over 18 metres?
Yes, I had a very competent team that worked beneath me.
Yes. But your personal, professional experience and expertise in relation to rain screen cladding and external facades on high-rise buildings over 18 metres, was limited, I think. Would you accept that? Yes. I mean, you were reliant on the expertise of those in your teams.
Yes.
Does that tell us that you weren't, or maybe you were, help me, familiar with components being used in the external walls of high-rise buildings in 2013?
I think my awareness increased significantly in 2014.
Yes, but in 2013, what was the baseline?
An understanding of the requirements of the regulations, an understanding of the detail within approved document B, but no practical application of that on a project-specific basis except by exception.
So do I take it from that answer that you understood Section 12 of Approved Document B as it then was?
Yes.
And similarly, the fact that it was guidance directed to compliance with the functional requirement B4 Part 1?
Yes.
Have you had, or had you had at that time, 2013, any personal first-hand experience with either small-scale or large-scale fire testing?
No.
How familiar were you in 2013 with BS 8414, either Parts 1 or Part 2 or both, and the BR 135 criteria?
I would say I wasn't familiar.
Not. Now let's look at NHBC BCS. I think it's also the case that you had been a director of NHBC Building Control Services, a subsidiary of NHBC, since 2012. Is that correct?
Yes.
And NHBC BCS Limited is a private company, isn't it, through which NHBC provides building control services, yes?
It's a wholly owned subsidiary of NHBC.
Yes, and it provides building control services.
Correct.
For a fee?
Yes.
Yes. And I think NHBC is a non-profit distributing company, but its wholly owned subsidiary makes money, put it bluntly.
It provides a service for which it gets paid for, yes.
Yes. There isn't any other shareholder in NHBC BCS other than NHBC, is there?
That's correct.
Now, you were a director of the subsidiary company. What were your responsibilities? And I don't want a list of the legal responsibilities. What were your practical responsibilities and duties as a director of NHBC BCS Limited?
The day-to-day oversight of the operation of our approved inspector service, the maintenance of our approved inspector licence, ensuring that we met any criteria set by our regulator, being sick air, making sure that applications for licence reapprovals were carried out, having suitable insurance in place to operate as an approved inspector, and carrying out audits as required by our regulator.
Would that also include business planning, setting and meeting budgets, and the financial performance of the company?
Yes, yes.
Yes. And did it also involve you reporting to the main board of NHBC?
On occasions, yes. The Building Control Services Board was chaired by Ian Davis, and Ian Davis was a main board member, so he would report back into the main board. That's when it was just executive directors on the board and heads of department. Prior to that, there was non-executive directors that formed Building Control Services Board, and on at least a yearly basis, the chairman of the board would report back to the main NHBC board on the activities of Building Control Services.
From 2013, apart from Ian Davis as the common director, were there any other common directors, as between NHBC, the parent company, and NHBC Building Control Services Limited, the subsidiary?
I'm not sure if the finance director may have been a common director at that point in time.
Now, you told us that you were, as head of building control at NHBC, saddled with, if that's the right word, the responsibility for the building control licence. Is that the case from 2012 up to 2019?
Yes.
Yes. And therefore, I think you would agree, would you, that you were ultimately responsible for all building control decisions made by NHBC?
I would be responsible for, yes, but that would be done in conjunction with advice and on a consensus basis with others.
Which others?
If it was a technical matter, I would use the expertise of my team. I would also refer to Ian Davis as chairman of the board occasionally if there were things that needed discussing at an NHBC board rather than Building Control Services Board.
Did you ever report to NHBC board directly yourself?
Yes, I have attended NHBC board.
Right. Was that a regular occurrence?
I wouldn't say regular, but there are definite occasions when I would report into the board on different matters relating to Building Control Services
Right.
Limited.
And was there a standing arrangement whereby you would report the affairs of NHBC BCS Limited, including the financial affairs, to the main board?
I think that was a standing agenda item and papers to the board. It wouldn't necessarily be me that attended. It could be Ian Davis that attended.
Right. And would you produce those papers yourself? Would you generate them or at least approve them?
I think they would be generated. Certainly the financial performance would have been with our accounts department in terms of preparing the annual accounts and reporting those to the board as necessary. I would review the annual accounts before they were delivered to the main NHBC board. Any papers that would be delivered would, I'm trying to recall if it was myself or Ian that would have prepared those. And I think it could have been both of us.
And what about technical matters? Did you report technical matters regularly or irregularly to the main board yourself, either in paper form or by way of presentation?
Yes, as required.
As required. Do you still hold the position of Operations Director at NHBC?
I do, yes.
You do. And do you have responsibility as at today for the parts of the business that deal with NHBC's warranties or insurance?
The Operations Directorate is responsible for the Technical Operations Department, which is the department that Steve Evans now leads. There is the Inspection Department, which is all of our field-based inspection staff going out on site, and our Standards and Technical Department is now part of Operations.
And what role do you have in relation to NHBC warranties?
NHBC warranty, just clarify the point that you're trying to get.
Well, let me ask it this way. What role, do you have a role in relation to the issue and honouring of NHBC warranties as at today?
My teams look at the technical aspects in relation to compliance with NHBC standards, and they also carry out the inspections to make sure that the on-site construction is being dealt with in accordance with NHBC standards. My team don't get involved in the policy wording or the underwriting or other aspects in relation to warranty.
Who is the underwriting done by?
Our underwriting department.
And that's a separate department, is it?
It is, yes.
You have no role in that, do you?
No.
Right. Now, let me ask you about some memberships. In your statement, I think you list a number of memberships, including the Chartered Association of Building Engineers, yes?
Yes.
The Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors.
Yes.
The Construction Industry Council Approved Inspectors Register, CCAR, yes?
Yes.
And the Building Regulations Advisory Committee, BRAC, and also the ACAI and the BCA.
Yes.
Yeah, and you're members of all of those?
At the time of writing this, NHBC were a member of ACAI. We've declined to renew our membership with that organisation.
Why is that?
Purely because NHBC, in its own right, has the opportunity to meet with officials and departments without needing to go through the Association of Consultant Approved Inspectors.
Why was the decision made to come away from the ACIA?
It was a decision that was made at the Building Control Services Board, and it reflected our thinking at the time.
When was that decision made?
It would have been between October and now, so I think it was just before Christmas.
Right. And why was it made?
Well, as I stated, it was reported to the board the value of remaining a member of ACAI. There was limited value. There was an intention to increase the subscription fees, and the evaluation was that we didn't think it was best value.
Right. I mean, what had happened between, let's say, 2017 and 2021 to cause that decision to be made?
The extent and activity of the association.
Now, in your statement, please, page 4, if we can go to that, paragraph 15, you say this. Although I'm employed by NHBC, I often attend these various professional groups in a personal capacity. I feel strongly that NHBC and the industry generally needs to share experience and understanding of complex technical issues to ensure that we get the best possible results in terms of compliance with the building regulations. In essence, I believe in proactively engaging with various bodies to ensure an industry-wide focus. Now, which groups did you attend in a personal capacity as opposed to in your position as Head of Technical Services at the NHBC?
My appointment to BRAC was in a personal capacity, and my attendance my involvement in the Sick Care Management Board is in a personal capacity.
Right. Why those two, particularly?
Just the way the organisations are set up, that they look for personal involvement rather than organisational representation.
Other than the BCA, were you involved with the topic, if I can call it that, of external fire spread on buildings over 18 metres as part of any of these groups?
It would have been discussed at BRAC meetings in terms of... sorry, could you just scroll up to the point about the BRAC appointment, if that's possible, please?
Yes, absolutely. It's E at the top of page 4.
That was in 2019,
Yes.
and I think the new regulations around non-combustible materials would have been 2018. So it may have been the legacy papers that I would have seen as being a BRAC member.
I follow. Now, let me ask you about the BCA. Have you been a member of the BCA since its inception in 2008?
I've been on the BCA executive since 2008, representing the Chartered Association of Building Engineers.
And I think it's right to say that you worked with Steve Evans at the BCA since that date, yes?
No, both Steve and I are employed by NHBC. I represent the Chartered Association of Building Engineers at the BCA. Steve is or was chairman of the BCA Technical Committee, and he was there representing ACAI.
Yes, but it's right to say that you together worked at the BCA or in relation to BCA matters.
In relation to BCA matters, yes.
Yes. And in 2008, I think he was still at the LABC, wasn't he?
Yes.
Were you at any time a director of the BCA?
Yes.
Between which dates?
I think it would have been not long after it was formed, and we closed the company, I think, last year.
Right. And were you on the executive committee of the BCA during those?
Yes.
Between those dates, you were. And it's right, I think, isn't it, that Steve Evans was the chair of the BCA technical group between 2010 and 2019, as he, I think, has told us.
Yes.
Yes. Do you remember whether he would send guidance notes to the BCA executive committee for acceptance?
Yes, he would.
He would. Were you at any time the chair of the BCA?
Yes, the chair of the BCA rotated around the 5 member organisations on an annual basis. So the year that it was the turn of the Chartered Association of Building Engineers, I chaired the meetings for that period.
And which were those dates? Which were those years?
I think it was around 2012, but I'm not sure.
Now, you told us that it was closed, the BCA was closed. Why was it closed?
I think there's a section in my statement that references the discussions that we had with MHCLG, and they engaged with all of the constituent members of the BCA and NHBC in its own right, CIC and SICAIR, and asked us to do a piece of work on the future of building control, which we published a report in relation to. And as a consequence of that, there was discussions around rebranding the group of BCA into the future of building control with MHCLG's acknowledgement of that working group and doing whatever work was required on a broader basis. So as a consequence of that, the company was closed.
Yes, thank you. Now, I'd like to ask you some questions about NHB's position from time to time on combustible materials, starting with ACM. Mm-hmm. As head of building control as at 2013, what was NHBC's position on the use of ACM cladding panels on external facades of buildings over 18 metres?
Did you say 2013?
Yes.
Right. In 2013, I would have expected the surveyors to establish compliance by following the guidance within the approved document.
Right. Was there a standing NHBC policy about the use of ACM cladding panels in external facades on buildings over 18 metres?
Not in 2013, no.
Now, can we go please to page 10 of your statement and look at paragraph 42 together? You say there, as I explained at paragraph 17 above, in relation to buildings over 18 metres tall, I was involved in the policy decisions which specified the types of materials or external wall arrangements which would be acceptable to NHBC for building control purposes. Now, if we look at paragraph 17, just go back to that on page 4. It says this, my involvement in NHBC's decision-making relating to the use of products in the external wall arrangements of buildings over 18 metres tall to comply with the building regulations and approved document B is described at paragraph 78. In summary, NHBC produced a guidance note in 2016. This was produced by staff in my department. I was briefed, along with Ian Davis, Operations Director, who presented the guidance note to the Executive Committee on 1st July 2016 and ultimately signed it off. Now, my question is, what was NHBC's policy in relation to combustible materials in external facades above 18 metres in 2013?
There was no formal policy in 2013 other than ensuring compliance by following the approved document.
Right. So, I see. Now, when you say that, as you do, I was involved, and to go back to paragraph 42, I was involved, you say, in the policy decisions which specify the types of materials or external wall arrangements which would be acceptable to NHBC for building control purposes. How are those policy decisions made?
There would be discussions of the technical aspects around compliance, debate around the wording within the approved document, and agreement and consensus on a way forward.
And when you say you were involved in those decisions, who is it who made the final decisions on the types of materials that were acceptable to NHBC?
As head of building control, the responsibility would have been mine, but it would have been taken on the basis of technical advice and guidance being provided,
right,
with the exception of the 2016 guidance note, which did go to the executive directors because of the implications of that guidance note.
Yes, and we'll come and look at that later in your evidence. What data or testing would you personally rely upon in order to decide which materials or external wall arrangements were acceptable for NHBC building control purposes?
I would rely on the advice of my specialists and experts within the organisation.
Right. And does that tell us that you yourself did no research personally in respect of particular materials or products in order to make decisions on their acceptability?
No, I didn't feel that I needed to with the experience that I had within my team.
As a matter of, if not policy, then routine, did NHBC allow combustible materials in external facades over 18 metres in the years up to and including 2013?
Our current knowledge at the moment is yes, we did.
And your knowledge at the time?
Was that we weren't allowing them.
Your knowledge at the time was that you weren't allowing them. Just explain that to me. So if you put your mind back in the position that it was in 2013, was that mind that NHBC did not allow combustible materials in an external wall build-up over 18 metres?
The position in 2013 would have been the expectation that my surveyors and project managers would have assessed each scheme on its own merits against the requirements of approved document B and assessed those in relation to either non-combustible materials or product certification, and when this matter was raised in 2014 and discussed with Steve Evans and John Lewis in relation to the element around the non-combustible facades and filler, I was reassured that the interpretation of my colleagues was that that would have been applied robustly to ensure that filler, etc., was included in the assessment.
Now, that last answer covers a lot of ground, which we're going to cover in a bit more step by step. What I want to know is, in 2013, before what happened in 2014, was your mind, did you think that NHBC, as a result of your surveyor's work, was or was not accepting the use of combustible materials in external wall build-ups in buildings over 18 metres?
I had no indication that we were accepting ACM at that point.
Yes. Did you think that you were, or did you think that you weren't?
My understanding in 2013 was that we weren't.
Right. And why was that? Did you have an understanding as to why that was?
Because of following the guidance within the approved document.
So, was it your understanding at the time that your surveyors would routinely reject the use of combustible materials in external wall build-ups over 18 metres because of their understanding of approved document B?
Yeah, could you just clarify? You mentioned ACM and then you mentioned combustible materials. So they're two different aspects.
No, I think you mentioned ACM, Ms. Lewis, not me. But never mind. Let me ask the question again. Was it your understanding at the time that your surveyors would routinely reject the use of combustible materials in external wall build-ups over 18 metres because of the way in which they understood approved document B?
Yeah, apologies if there's confusion. There would have been acceptance of products if they had independent certification.
Could you just explain what you mean by that? Independent certification of what?
Of the products. So in relation to the question around combustible materials, the surveyors would have followed the guidance within the approved document. But if a product was certified by the likes of BBA and that BBA certificate was taken as an independent assessment of a UCAS accredited certification body, that would be taken as suitable evidence subject to the terms of that condition certificate.
What was NHBC's position on ACM panels in 2013?
Again, to my knowledge at the time, was that we wouldn't accept ACM panels because of the requirements for the filler, etc., to be non-combustible. So
does that tell us that NHBC's experience and indeed policy was that the core of an ACM panel, because it could never be non-combustible or of limited combustibility, couldn't be used above 18 metres?
Yeah, under options 1 and 2, yes.
Well, you careful, because you say under options 1 or 2. Are you meaning there the linear route to compliance under section 12.5, 6 and 7, or are you meaning the full-scale testing under 12.5 through 8414 and BR135?
Yes, both of those.
Right. So when you say options 1 and 2, those are shorthands derived from a later document, aren't they?
Yes, that's correct.
We need to be careful here with terms. So does that tell us that NHBC would routinely refuse to accept ACM panels with a PE core in the years up to and including 2013?
To my knowledge, yes.
Yes. On the basis, as I think you've explained, that the core, because it could never be a MOLC, a material of limited combustibility, would mean that it would fail the requirements as you understood them?
Yes.
Yes. And you've mentioned filler a minute ago. That's getting ahead a little bit. Let's just take it a little bit more slowly. Can we go to page 7 of your statement, paragraph 32? You say there that historically the core element of any external cladding system was not considered in the guidance contained within the approved documents. Now, why do you say that the core of a cladding panel was not considered in the approved documents?
The definition or the wording within section 12, where it introduced filler, etc., under insulation, was only introduced into the 2006 version of approved document B. So prior to that, and I think it was the 2000 version as amended, there was no mention of filler.
So does that answer, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, mean that when the amendment was made in the 2006 version, which I think came in April 2007,
Yes.
you read the word filler material ... etc. as applying to the core of an ACM panel?
At the time in 2007, when it was introduced, I wasn't looking at specific projects, so I wouldn't necessarily have linked the two together. In 2013, when the issue around certification of products came to light, I spoke with colleagues around how we as an organisation were applying filler, etc., because it is confusing, or it was confusing in my mind. I didn't have the working knowledge of the approved document and how it was being applied in practice. Therefore, speaking to colleagues when this issue came to light in 2014, I was reassured by colleagues that that was the way that it was being routinely applied.
I see. So does that tell us that for a period, your own understanding was that the core of an external cladding panel was not covered by ADB?
It's difficult to say one way or the other because I wasn't looking at specific projects,
Right.
or offering any advice in relation to the interpretation of that guidance.
Can I just ask you this? There was that change to the text of ADB
Yes.
in 2007, where the words filler and etc. were interpolated. Were any steps taken at that stage to discuss and disseminate to surveyors what they meant?
Yes, there was, and we had a specialist surveyor working for NHBC at the time that produced some training material in 2007, and by reference to the material I can see that the slides included insulation, filler, etc. I wasn't at the training, so I don't know what debate was around those words, but it was certainly identified as an addition to approved document B. Whether or not that was fully understood by all of the participants, I can't say.
But I mean, it sounds to me as though some attempt was made to give an instruction to surveyors about the implication of those new words.
Yes, it was something different within the approved document that didn't exist previously and had been identified as a change.
There was a corporate view was taken, is that fair?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Thank you. Did your own understanding about the meaning of the word filler change at any time?
I think in 2014 it was confirmed that that was the understanding of my colleagues and the project teams that were applying the requirements, and supported by the work that was being done through the Building Control Alliance. The guidance document contained clarification around all elements, and that was a common understanding within the BCA technical group.
Was that because of the word filler as you understood it, or because of the more general requirement that no part of the external wall build-up should contribute to the surface spread of fire?
I think it was around the term filler, etc., that created the debate and discussion.
Did you ever approach the government department, the DCLG, at that time in relation to the lack of guidance on the meaning of the word filler, or on the core of external cladding panels?
No, I think we did, or Steve Evans did, in 2015, I believe.
Now, you've told us that you were familiar with paragraphs 12.5 to 12.9 of approved document B. Did you yourself consider, leaving aside perhaps the word filler, that all elements of the external facade should be of limited combustibility?
If they were following option 1, yes.
So you call it option 1.
Yes.
I might call it the linear route, but it
Yes.
doesn't matter. Yes, good. And therefore, if the core of a cladding panel was not addressed in the approved documents, what was the NHBC's historic policy on the use of ACM panels with different types of combustible cores?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yes. Before the change, let's try it this way, before the change in 2007, what had been NHBC's approach to the use of combustible cored ACM panels?
Following the guidance within the approved document, from recollection, it only had effectively options 1 and 2 included within the 2000 version.
Yeah. And does that tell us that NHBC signed off no high-rise buildings which used ACM panels in the years up to and including 2013, and certainly not after 2007 and 2013?
Not to my knowledge.
Right. Let me ask you about insulation. Were you familiar with paragraph 12.7 of B4 particularly?
Yes.
I think you were, given what you've just told us. Let's have it up. It's at CLG 50224, please, at page 96. Now, it's well worn in this inquiry, and I'm not going to spend time reading it out unless you want me to. But its heading is Insulation Materials / Products. And just look at the words there. In relation to Kingspan's K15 and Celatex's RS5000, did you ever believe at any time that they could be used over 18 metres in accordance with that provision?
Not in accordance with this provision, but within the approved document, there is the acceptance of the status of independent certification.
What does that mean? I'm sorry. What do you mean by that?
A BBA certificate.
Do you mean? Well, what do you mean by that? You say there's. Let me just explore it without putting words in your mouth. You say that in the approved documents there is the acceptance of the status of independent certification. How does that work, allowing a particular material or product to comply with this paragraph?
It doesn't necessarily associate with this paragraph, but at the front of the approved document, there is recognition of the status of independent testing on a product to show that it is suitable for use. And the BBA certificate covered the installation of Kingspan with certain conditions attached to that certificate.
And how would that satisfy 12.7, looking at the language of it?
It doesn't satisfy 12.7. It satisfies the approved document or the regulation in an alternative way.
Well, how in an alternative way?
By the use of independent certification of the product.
Does that mean that if you, NHBC, received a BBA certificate, what would that BBA certificate have to say in order to comply with 12.7?
It's not 12.7 itself. It's the requirement under Regulation 7, which allows the use of independent certification to assess a product's performance. And that certificate would be reviewed to see how it addressed the issues around fire safety.
And when you say Regulation 7, do you mean Regulation 7 or do you mean the approved document supporting Regulation 7?
Well, the approved document supporting Regulation 7, there were also at the front of the approved document supporting Part B, there's also reference to some of the elements of the Regulation 7 approved document.
I mean, to cut through this is what you're telling us, that so far as the NHBC was concerned, it had to look no further than a BBA certificate if the BBA certificate said that 12.7 was satisfied in respect of a particular insulation material?
I think the status of a BBA certificate is well established. It's an independent UCAS certified body that carries out testing and assessment of a range of building products. And certainly in all of my time that I've been in building control, they have been accepted as being reliable and well researched, and they have a standing in the industry where they can be used as a reference.
So is the answer to my question yes?
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, is that a convenient moment?
Yes, I think it is. Thank you very much. Well, Ms. Marshall, it's time we had a break so everyone can get some lunch. We'll stop now. We'll resume, please, at 2 o'clock. And since you started giving evidence, I have to ask you, please, not to talk to anyone about your evidence or anything relating to it while you're out of the room. All right?
Yes, thank
Thank
you.
you very much. Would you go with the usher, please? Thank you very much, Mr. Millett. 2 o'clock, please. Okay.